Chinasa was a very beautiful girl in the village of Dama. She was the only daughter of a wealthy king, and her beauty was like the bright moon shining over the village. Everyone who saw her couldn't help but talk about how stunning she was. But Chinasa was not just beautiful. She was also a very smart merchant. She traveled far and wide, trading goods and bringing wealth to her family. When it came time for Chinasa to marry, people thought she would choose a rich man like herself, but to everyone's surprise, she married Obasi, a poor carpenter. Obasi was kind and loved Chinasa with all his heart, but he was as poor as the dry ground during the Harmattan season. In Dama village, there was a tradition. When a woman was wealthier than her husband, she became the head of the house. This meant that Chinasa had all the power, and Obasi had to listen to her. Though Obasi loved her deeply, he sometimes felt like a small pebble lying in the shadow of a great mountain. He did everything she asked without complaining, but deep down, he wished he could be more than just the man who followed her commands. Chinasa was happy with their life, traveling for business and making more money, while Obasi stayed behind, quietly wishing things could be different. Obasi was a hard-working man. Every day, he worked as a carpenter, shaping wood with his hands. But when he returned home, life was not easy. His friends, who watched him quietly, teased him. "Obasi, you are more like her servant than her husband," they would say, laughter in their voices. "Do you even remember what it means to be a man in your own house?" Obasi would smile weakly, but their words were like thorns in his heart. At home, Obasi's life was even harder. Every day he cooked the meals, swept the floors, and washed Chinasa's clothes, all while she was away on her long business trips. He didn't complain, but inside he felt like a leaf blown around by the wind, having no control over where he landed. His hands worked without rest, but his heart felt heavier with each passing day. The love he had for Chinasa was still there, but the weight of being treated like a servant was growing too large for him to carry. He wanted to be more than just the man who did the chores and took orders, but Obasi never spoke up. His lips stayed sealed like a pot with no lid, holding all his feelings inside. The silence grew, and so did his sadness, but Obasi didn't know how to change things. When Chinasa and Obasi first got married, Chinasa would leave the village for her business trips, but only for a few days at a time. Obasi waited for her eagerly, counting the days until she returned. But as time went on, those few days stretched longer. What was once a short trip became a week, then sometimes even more. Obasi found himself sitting alone in their house, feeling like a shadow, always there, but invisible. When Chinasa returned, it wasn't with the warmth of a wife coming home. Instead, she talked only about her business, how many goods she had sold, how much money she had made, and the new places she had been. She barely looked at Obasi except to give him more tasks to do around the house. "Obasi, clean the floors. Obasi, wash my clothes," she would say, and he would obey without a word. But inside, Obasi's heart was aching. He felt like a tree standing all alone in an empty field with no one to care for it. The longer Chinasa stayed away, the lonelier he became. Obasi wanted to ask her why she was gone for so long. He wanted to know if something had changed between them. But every time he opened his mouth to speak, the words would not come out. They were trapped inside him like birds in a cage, fluttering and desperate to be free. So, he stayed silent, hoping that one day Chinasa would notice the sadness in his eyes. 8 long years had passed since Chinasa and Obasi were married, yet their home was still quiet, without the laughter of children. In the village, children were seen as the greatest blessing, like rain in a time of drought. But without them, Obasi and Chinasa's house felt empty, like a roof without walls to support it. Obasi's heart ached more with each passing day. He longed for a child to hold, to bring life to their quiet home. The absence of children weighed heavily on him, like carrying a basket of stones on his back. Each time he saw the other men in the village playing with their children, his heart sank deeper, and the emptiness in his chest grew wider. Whenever Obasi tried to speak to Chinasa about their childlessness, she would brush him off like dust on her sleeve. "There are more important things to worry about," she would say, dismissing his concerns as if they were nothing. But for Obasi, the silence on the matter was unbearable. It was like a stone pressing hard on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. He couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was wrong, something Chinasa wasn't telling him. But no matter how much he wanted to know, Chinasa refused to talk about it, and so the years passed with Obasi's heart growing heavier under the weight of the unspoken truth. As time passed, Chinasa's absences stretched even longer, and her returns became more distant. It was as if she was slipping further away from Obasi, like water running through his fingers. Obasi began to feel something heavy in his chest, a feeling that was not just loneliness, but suspicion. Like a bird watching dark clouds gather before a storm, with each long trip, Obasi's mind raced with questions he was too afraid to ask. Why does she stay away so long? Does she have another life in a place I don't know? The love that once bound them seemed to fade with each sunset. Where they once spoke of children and dreams, now there was only silence. Chinasa acted as if the childlessness didn't matter, as if the idea of a family had blown away like leaves in the wind. She no longer showed the warmth of a wife longing for a home filled with laughter. Obasi, on the other hand, was left in the shadow of doubt, wondering if he had done something wrong. Had he failed as a husband, or worse, had Chinasa's heart drifted far beyond the reach of their marriage? The silence between them grew louder, and Obasi's thoughts circled like a bird trapped in a storm. He feared that whatever love they once shared had been lost in the distance, and that his place in Chinasa's life was no longer as her husband, but merely a man who waited for her to return. Obasi had no idea that behind Chinasa's long absences was a secret as heavy as a mountain. In a faraway village, Chinasa had another husband, a powerful man named Anak. Anak wasn't as wealthy as Chinasa, but in his village he was respected like a great lion. Unlike Obasi, Anak ruled his household with authority. He didn't care that Chinasa had more money. He was the head, and Chinasa feared him because of his power. Chinasa hadn't married Anak for love. No, she had married him as a way to grow her business. Anak had connections and influence, and with him by her side, Chinasa's merchant trade flourished like crops after the rain. But in return, Anak wanted something from her. He wanted a child. Just like Obasi, Anak had been waiting for years for Chinasa to bear him a child, but no matter how long he waited, the child never came. The weight of her secret life pressed on Chinasa like carrying two heavy baskets, one in each hand. She was torn between two husbands, two villages, and two lives. With Anak, she had to play the obedient wife, fearful of his power. With Obasi, she had control, but their marriage was empty without love or children. Chinasa carried this burden in silence, never letting either man know the full truth. And as the days went by, the weight of her lies grew heavier, like stones piling up in her heart. Obasi, tired of living with unanswered questions, decided to visit a powerful herbalist in the village. This herbalist was known to see what others couldn't, and Obasi hoped he could find the truth behind Chinasa's coldness and their childless marriage. With a heavy heart, Obasi entered the herbalist's small, smoky hut, hoping for some light to be shed on his troubled soul. The herbalist sat before the fire, his face glowing in the flickering light, and asked Obasi what he sought. Obasi, trying to keep his voice steady, said, "I need to know why my wife and I have no children after so many years." The herbalist closed his eyes, chanting softly under his breath. The air felt thick with mystery, and Obasi watched, his heart pounding like a drum. After a long silence, the herbalist opened his eyes and spoke, his words slow and deliberate. "The womb of your wife has been locked," the herbalist said, his voice steady as a rock. "She cannot bear children, for it was her husband who sealed her womb with a curse." Obasi's heart stopped. Her husband? Confusion swept over him like a raging storm. He was Chinasa's only husband, or at least that's what everyone believed. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. "But I am her husband," Obasi whispered to himself, his words trembling. The herbalist didn't know Obasi was speaking of his own wife and continued, "The curse was placed long ago to punish her. No man can unlock her womb now." Obasi's mind whirled. He felt like the ground beneath him was crumbling, leaving him to fall into an abyss of confusion and disbelief. How could this be? He had never cursed his wife. He had only ever loved her. Then, like a flash of lightning cutting through the darkness, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Chinasa had been hiding something far deeper than he had ever imagined. The revelation hit Obasi like a wave crashing against rocks. Chinasa had another life, another husband. The truth had been sitting right before him, but he had never seen it. His hands trembled as he left the herbalist's hut, feeling betrayed and lost. The secret Chinasa had kept was like a knife in his heart, twisting with every thought of the years they had spent together, the years he had hoped for a child, while she carried this dark truth. One evening, after many weeks of being away, Chinasa returned home. But this time something was terribly different. She no longer walked with the grace of a queen. Instead, her steps were slow, her shoulders hunched like a bird with broken wings. Her once beautiful face was now marked with bruises, and the fire in her eyes had dimmed. Obasi, who had been silently suffering for years, felt a surge of emotions, anger, worry, and confusion welling up inside him. When Obasi saw her, his heart raced. For so long, he had stayed silent, but this was too much. The sight of Chinasa's bruised face shook him to his core. His hands clenched into fists, not out of anger toward her, but out of fear and concern. For the first time in their marriage, Obasi's voice rose above a whisper. "What happened to you, Chinasa? Who did this to you?" His voice trembled with a mixture of anger and fear, emotions he had buried deep inside for so long. Chinasa, caught off guard by Obasi's sudden boldness, looked away, her lips pressed tightly together. She had never seen Obasi like this, demanding answers. He was no longer the quiet man who had always obeyed without question. But instead of answering, she remained silent, her eyes avoiding his gaze. Her body language said everything. She refused to speak, and the silence between them was thick, like a storm cloud hanging overhead. Obasi's concern quickly turned into suspicion. Why wouldn't she tell him? What was she hiding? His mind raced back to the herbalist's words. Her husband had locked her womb. Was this the same man who had bruised her? Who was the man she was protecting with her silence? Obasi's heart beat faster as doubt and suspicion swirled inside him. His once gentle eyes now held a spark of anger and confusion. For Chinasa, silence screamed louder than any words could. In another village, Anak, Chinasa's secret husband, was growing restless. Days turned into weeks, and Chinasa had been gone far too long. Anak was not a man who waited patiently. His power and influence made him a man of action. When Chinasa had disappeared before, she always returned quickly. But this time, her absence stretched longer, and with each passing day, Anak's anger grew like wildfire. He paced back and forth in his compound, his thoughts racing. Where could she be? He had given her freedom because of her business, but Anak never imagined she would leave him in the dark like this. The villagers had started to whisper, sensing something was wrong. Anak could no longer hide his frustration, so he called a gathering and announced that Chinasa, his wife, was missing. The news spread quickly, like the wind through the trees. It wasn't long before someone came forward with information. "I know where she is," a voice said from the crowd. "She is in Dama village." Anak's eyes narrowed. Dama village? Why would she be there? His mind began to churn with suspicion. The thought of Chinasa being with another man gnawed at him like a hungry beast. Anak was not a man to be disrespected, and this betrayal, if true, would not go unanswered. Without wasting time, Anak set out on a journey to Dama village, his heart filled with a storm of anger and questions. He needed to know why Chinasa had been gone so long, and, more importantly, why she was hiding in another village. His mind raced with thoughts of betrayal, and his anger simmered, waiting to explode. Anak arrived in Dama village with fire in his eyes and thunder in his heart. He marched through the village, his presence causing heads to turn and whispers to spread. Word quickly reached Obasi's ears that a stranger was storming toward his home. Before long, the two men stood face to face outside Obasi's house, the tension between them crackling like lightning. Anak's eyes landed on Chinasa, who stood frozen in the doorway. His voice boomed like a thunderclap. "What are you doing here, Chinasa, in another man's home?" His words were laced with fury, his face twisted with betrayal. Obasi, who had been quietly living in confusion for weeks, now understood everything. He knew Anak wasn't just a stranger, he was the other husband. His heart pounded, but for the first time, Obasi didn't back down. "This is my house and Chinasa is my wife," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Anak's eyes flared. "Your wife?" "She is my wife." The two men stared each other down, their voices rising with each word. The villagers, curious and alarmed by the commotion, began to gather around, forming a circle around the three of them. Their whispers filled the air like the rustling of leaves in the wind. The truth hung heavy in the air, but neither Obasi nor Anak was willing to back down. In their heated argument, the truth slipped out like a snake from the shadows. "Her womb is locked," Anak shouted. "She cannot have children because of what her husband did to her." Obasi's face tightened. "And who is this husband who locked her womb?" he asked, his voice bitter with the knowledge he had recently learned. "I am not the one," Anak replied, his voice dark. "That was not my doing. It was the curse of another before me." The crowd gasped, the revelation shocking everyone present. Obasi felt a wave of anger and betrayal wash over him. Chinasa had been hiding so much from him, not just her secret life, but the truth about her cursed womb. All eyes turned to Chinasa, who stood silent, her face pale like the moon. The weight of her lies was now crushing her, and there was no more hiding. The villagers murmured, some in disbelief, others in disgust. Chinasa had deceived them all, living two lives, and now the truth was out for everyone to see. The two men, both of whom had claimed her as their wife, stood united in their betrayal. Chinasa, once the admired daughter of a king, now faced the harsh judgment of the village. The storm she had tried to outrun had finally caught up with her, and there was no escaping the truth. Chinasa stood in the center of the gathered crowd, her heart pounding like a drumbeat of doom. She had no more lies to hide behind, no more tricks to use. Her two husbands, Obasi and Anak, stood before her, their faces heavy with betrayal and anger. The villagers, eyes wide and mouths whispering, waited for her to speak. There was no escaping the truth now. Chinasa swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she began to speak. I have a confession," she said, her words like a cold wind sweeping through the village. The people leaned in closer, eager to hear the truth from the woman who had lived two lives. "I was once married a long time ago," Chinasa began, her eyes cast down, "to a wealthy man in another village. He loved me dearly, but She paused, her voice breaking. "I betrayed him. I was unfaithful with his own brother." A collective gasp echoed through the crowd. The villagers couldn't believe what they were hearing. Chinasa's beauty and wealth had once been admired by all, but now she stood stripped of everything but her shame. "My husband found out," she continued, her voice now barely a whisper. "He was furious, and in his rage, he cursed me before he died. He locked my womb so that I would never bear a child." Her eyes filled with tears, but she pressed on. "That is why I have no children. That is why, no matter how much Anak or Obasi hoped, I could never give them the family they wanted." Obasi and Anak stood in stone silence. The truth was like a thick fog lifting, revealing the harsh reality they had both been blind to. They had spent years wondering why they had no children, blaming themselves, questioning their own worth, when all along Chinasa had been hiding this dark secret. Obasi felt a wave of sorrow wash over him. He had loved Chinasa, despite all the pain and confusion, and now the truth felt like a knife in his heart. Anak too stood frozen, his mind racing as he realized that all his power and influence could never undo the curse that had sealed Chinasa's fate. The villagers, too, were shaken by the confession. Chinasa, once the pride of their village, had fallen so far. Her deception had not only hurt her husbands, but had also stained her once glorious name. As Chinasa stood before them, her head bowed in shame, she knew that nothing would ever be the same. The truth, now out in the open, had shattered the lives of those she had touched, and there was no going back. The silence that followed Chinasa's confession was thick and heavy, like the weight of an old tree ready to fall. Anak and Obasi stood side by side, no longer rivals, but men united in their pain and betrayal. The crowd watched in shock as the two husbands, their hearts now shattered, looked at the woman they once called wife. Obasi was the first to speak, his voice low and filled with sorrow. "Chinasa, I loved you, I trusted you, but you have deceived me, not once but for years. There is no place for lies in a marriage, and I cannot be your husband anymore." His words were like the final nail in a coffin, sealing the fate of their broken relationship. Anak, who had always been powerful and feared, now stood quietly, his anger replaced by a cold resolve. "I gave you everything, my respect, my name, and my patience, but you dishonored me. You cannot be my wife any longer." His tone was sharp, like the cut of a blade, leaving no room for forgiveness. The villagers who had once admired Chinasa's beauty and wealth now turned their faces away. She was no longer the proud merchant, the daughter of a rich king. She was a woman who had lost everything: her husbands, her status, and the respect of the village. With her heart heavy and her spirit broken, Chinasa packed her belongings. It was a painful sight, like watching a once tall and strong tree stripped of all its leaves, left bare and exposed. She carried her things out of Obasi's house, the home she had ruled over, now with nothing but regret and sorrow. As Chinasa walked through the village, the people who had once praised her now turned their backs. No one offered her a hand, a word of comfort, or even a glance of pity. She had betrayed not just her husbands, but the trust of the entire village. Chinasa had lost everything. Her marriages were over, her wealth meant nothing, and the life she had carefully built was now in ruins. She walked away alone, her footsteps heavy with the weight of all she had done. There was no place for her in Obasi's life, nor in Anak's world. The proud woman who once had everything now had nothing but the silence of a village that had turned its back on her. After Chinasa left, Obasi's life began to slowly heal, like a broken plant sprouting new leaves. The weight of his past with Chinasa no longer hung over him. In time, he met a woman who brought light and love back into his life. She was kind, gentle, and honest, everything Obasi had longed for but never truly had. They married, and for the first time in years, Obasi felt like the man he had always wanted to be, the head of his own household. With his new wife, Obasi built a home filled with warmth and laughter, a home he could finally call his own. A year after their marriage, the greatest joy of all came to them: a baby, their first child. The sound of the baby's laughter filled their home like sweet music, bringing happiness that Obasi had once thought was impossible. The entire village rejoiced with him. The birth of Obasi's child was celebrated with great joy. The villagers who had watched his silent suffering for years now praised him. "This is a man who has seen hardship, but has now found happiness," they said. There were songs, dances, and feasts to honor the new life brought into the village. Obasi, holding his child in his arms, felt his heart swell with pride and love. He had found peace and a family, and the village stood by him in celebration. But while Obasi's life bloomed with new beginnings, Chinasa's life withered like a forgotten flower in the dry season. She remained in the village, but no one spoke to her. The once glorious woman who had commanded respect was now avoided by all. People whispered about her as she passed, but no one wanted to associate with her. Chinasa's days were filled with sorrow and regret. She watched from afar as Obasi, the man she had once taken for granted, found happiness without her. Each day, the weight of her choices pressed down on her, heavier and heavier. She had lost her husbands, her wealth, her status, and most painfully, the respect of the village. Obasi moved forward with his life, surrounded by love, while Chinasa remained trapped in her loneliness, her past mistakes haunting her like shadows she could never escape.